So good afternoon, and thanks for joining me as we continue our Lunch and Learns every day with one of your clergy members or other teachers of our congregation. I hope everyone's doing okay. As we kind of go through the Jewish calendar from Passover to Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day earlier this week, and now the next major holiday, two holidays really, beginning of next week, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut. Yom HaTzmaut, Israel Independence Day, and Yom HaZikaron is Day of Remembrance. It's a very fascinating way in which the state of Israel commemorates their independence every year. They first have Yom HaZikaron, which this year will be Monday night, Tuesday. It's a chance to commemorate all the soldiers and all the civilians that have been killed, whether it's in action in wars or in terrorist incidents. Unfortunately, over 25,000 Israelis have been killed these ways since the founding of the state in 1948. So first, it's an opportunity to memorialize all those who've lost their lives to fight for the state of Israel. And then the mournful mood of the day changes dramatically as Israel then moves into Yom HaTzmaut, Israel Independence Day. It'd be like if we had Memorial Day on July 3rd, and then right on Independence Day, July 4th. It's actually a very powerful way to commemorate an independence of a country, an ultimate reminder for Israelis, not that they need it, but really a reminder for us who don't live in Israel, that if it wasn't for those soldiers and for all the people that lost their lives, there would be no Israel Independence Day. If you ever have a chance to go to Israel this time of year, it is something to experience, going from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaTzmaut. There's nothing like it, and it's palatable, the feeling in the air of what it means to celebrate the birth of a country and what it means to realize the importance of an army to defend the state and defend people's homes. It's very powerful. It's one of the many things I love about Israel. And so over these next few weeks, as we commemorate Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaTzmaut next week, the 72nd anniversary of the founding of the state of Israel, I want to spend the next 3 weeks with you talking about why I love Israel. Why do I love Israel? Not as a conservative rabbi, but why as a Jew? What is it about Israel that I adore, that I cherish, that I treasure? And maybe you do as well. And I'd like to share some insights and some ideas that I hope you'll take with you. If you have any comments as I go through this Lunch and Learn, just post there on Facebook. Just write in and I'll answer back as soon as I can. And of course, feel free to email me after our session together. And I can answer any questions you may have. So with that, hopefully you'll see there, whatever way in which you're joining this Lunch and Learn, there's a posting of an article called A Non-Jews History of the Jews. And if you'll bring it up, and if you can't bring it up, that's okay, because I'm going to read much of this as well. Now, it's called A Non-Jews History of the Jews. It was written decades ago. It was written by a reverend named Donald Harrington in what he called the Miracle of Israel, a National Jewish Post and Opinion. A very old periodical that used to be somewhat popular in the Jewish world. And I thought this was just such a brilliant take on what it means to have Israel today. You know, for those of us living in 2020 in the modern era, we may take for granted that there isn't even a state of Israel. But let us not forget that for an overwhelming majority of our history, there was no Jewish presence in the land of Israel. There was a land of Israel, but there was no, let me rephrase that. There was no Jewish state in the land of Israel. There's always been a Jewish presence in the land of Israel, but there was no Jewish state. So our ancestors, very hard to travel there if they could at all. And when they got there, they were certainly the minority. It was often controlled by other empires. It was never ever any other state. It was just part of empires, whether it was the Romans or the Byzantines or the Ottomans or the British. So not until 1948 was it a Jewish state. And that means for almost 2,000 years, our people went without our own homeland in the land of Israel. What does that mean? And why is that important? And what does that mean for us living today? Well, for me, there's no better article, no better explanation than this piece written by this reverend many years ago that I wanted to share with you. Let me begin. He writes, if a storyteller of incredible imagination were to conceive the history of Israel as a piece of fiction, then project it story form for the enlightenment of others, people would read his story for its adventure, its courage, its daring, its inspiration, and its wisdom, but they would not believe it. It's a delightful and stirring, heart-rendering, and soul-shaking tale, they would say, but it couldn't have happened that way. Life is somehow not that magnificent. Let me give you a brief summary of that story. A small, ragged desert tribe wanders up out of the barren waste of sand known as the Negev and struggles to establish itself against competing tribes in the green area surrounding a river whose waters make fertile a small area in the wilderness of rock and sand. That river rises from some unknown source, deep in the ground, gushing out of the rocks, and then flows through the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, where it disappears into the air through evaporation, the strangest river in the entire world, the Jordan River. Slowly, the little band establishes itself under a patriarch Abraham. 2 generations later, it's forced by famine to flee to the neighboring country of Egypt. There, the people are enslaved until, under the leadership of Moses, they flee from Egypt and wander 40 years in the desert, finally returning once again to the land their ancestors centuries earlier had found and never forgot. So, of course, he's referencing the Passover story, which we just celebrated. We, according to the tradition, were slaves in the land of Egypt for 4 centuries, 400 years, and yet they kept that strategic and religious and spiritual allegiance to the land, which they eventually got back to under the leadership of Joshua. The writer continues, there they flourish and under many heroic leaders develop a civilization. They vanquish their enemies and conquer and settle their country. And for a short period of time, less than 200 years, they are independent, sovereign, and united under 3 great kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Soon they split again into warring tribes under their weakness are conquered again and again. Some 400 years later, they are carried away into Babylonian captivity. And 50 years later, Persia, who had conquered Babylon, gives them permission to return to their homeland to reestablish themselves. So there he's referencing 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. And then 50 years later, in 536 BCE, our people return under Ezra and Nehemiah and reestablish a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. The writer continues, but that's not the end of the story. Again, the land is invaded and ruled in succession by Persian, Macedonia, the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Romans. We think of the Hanukkah story under the Syrians, the Greek Assyrians, that kept our people from following many of the traditions, and yet we celebrate Hanukkah in memory of the Maccabees who reestablished and rededicated the temple, which was the second temple in Jerusalem. And then, of course, we think of the Romans who eventually destroyed the city and started our diaspora. More than 1,000 years after King David, they are once again decisively defeated by the Romans. Their capital city is burned to the ground, and they are carried away and dispersed, scattered among other nations in all parts of the earth. If you ever have a chance to go to the Diaspora Museum in Tel Aviv, it starts with that destruction of the Second Temple, which began our diaspora in 72 CE, which lasted until this day. After the Romans into their land come the Byzantines, who are followed by the Arabs, later on by the Crusaders, the Egyptian Mamelukes, the Ottoman Turks, and finally, in this century, the British. Each conqueror takes over the land to exploit it, abuse it, and persecute the small remnant of that people who once dwelt in the land. For 1,900 years, almost 2 millennia, the dispossessed people wander from place to place, living everywhere as strangers, as aliens, as people distrusted and easily preyed upon, because they are a tiny minority, set apart by their religion and the hostility of their neighbors. Wherever they're given the slightest chances in Spain or Sicily, they flourish and make great contributions to the people among whom they live. But soon, even they turn on them, and they tend to pull up stakes and move on, seeking a land of freedom a land where they can be themselves and breathe. The center of their cultural shifts with the winds of persecution from country to country, from Jerusalem to Alexandria to Rome, during the Muslim conquest to Spain, and following the Spanish Inquisition to Holland, Italy, and Turkey, and after the Crusaders' pogroms farther east to Poland and Russia. There, the author, in just a few paragraphs, really describes in a very painful way what it was like for our ancestors to live in Europe and most of the world during those centuries of diaspora. The author continues, during the 18th and 19th centuries, they established strong, if embattled communities, developing a rich, distinctive culture with an identity all its own and a color unmatched by almost any other in the history of the earth. Yet this culture is bound by strongest ties to its earliest beginnings and to that little land on the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean. Then in the early decades of our century, their life began to improve. Persecution diminished. The wall of hostility began to come down. He's, of course, now describing the Enlightenment that went through Western Europe, that our ancestors in Europe flourished under. They grew in substance and wealth and take leading positions among those with whom they dwell. But in mid-20th century, they experienced one more dreadful orgy of hate and persecution, which consumes 1/3 of their number throughout the world. 6 million Jews are destroyed in a spasm of hate, the result of 18 centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. No one yet knows the consequences for Christianity hidden in that terrible period. Historians hundreds of years from now may say that Christianity died when Christian Germany did what it did to the Jews. Now remember, this is a reverend writing this article. And remember what he describes of the Holocaust. But for the Jews, it meant something else. It gave them a sense of overwhelming urgency, a passion to regain the steering wheel of their own history, an irresistible imperative to go home again. They had not forgotten their origin, nor given up the hope that someday they would return to that strip of fertile land between the river and the sea. Recoiling from the unremitting persecution and the unforgivable slaughter of their kinfolk, they said with passionate determination, we must go home. There's no other answer but to go home again to that land from whence we came, to rebuild our life and give new hope to our children. 1900 years after their defeat and destruction, they are reborn again, the land and the people. The desert becomes green again, the barren hills are forested with pine trees, and the weary land refreshed with the living waters of a people's love. Villages spring up in old ash heaps. Towns and restless cities rise on dunes of drifting sand. And high up on the hills, between the Jordan and the sea, between the desert and the green countryside, Jerusalem, the queen, city of gold, is shining again in a new splendor. How did it happen? How did this miracle come to pass? How did this impossible dream come true? The answer is simple. These people grew a religion strong in its requirement and responsibility, unremitting in its demands, rich in its rewards and promise. Through every trial and trouble, despite the cruelest persecution, they clung to that religion. They preserved it and preserved them as a people. They became a living miracle, and their story has turned into the model and the hope of mankind. Reverend Donald Harrington, The Miracle of Israel, in National Jewish Post and Opinion. I love that article, not just because it was written by clergymen of the Christian faith, which is wonderful to see in and of itself, but because the Reverend in such beautiful and poetic language describes and reminds us what a miracle the state of Israel is. Not a perfect miracle, no country is, but let us never forget as we get ready to celebrate 72 years of Jewish independence, our state and our ancient homeland of Israel continues to flourish, continues to grow, and despite the overwhelming challenges, I believe continues to make us very proud. There are a lot of challenges, a lot of ways for Israel to continue to grow, but if we just don't forget, let us never forget what a miracle it is that we even have a Jewish state that we can go to, we can travel to, we can worship in, we can see the sights, breathe the same air, walk the same steps, that our ancestors walked thousands of years ago. It's where it all began for us as Jews. And thank God we live in a day and age where we can still go there, be part of it, support it, and watch it continue to flourish. How did it happen? Is it a miracle? That, of course, is up for you to decide. But to me, it is. That our people, one of the most persecuted, if not the most persecuted people on the face of the earth, not only were able to survive, but continue to keep that undying allegiance to that tiny, fertile strip of land on the Eastern Mediterranean. There's a reason why. There's a reason why we're back. And I believe we'll never have to leave again. And so as we approach Yom HaTzmaut this upcoming week, let us remember what a miracle it is to live in this day and age and what a miracle Israel is. As we go through the next several weeks, I hope to share with you other reasons why I love Israel. And I hope you'll continue to search your own reasons. Read up online, read those books. Now that you may have more time, study more of the history, study more of the reasons why it is a miracle, why it is a Nes, a modern Gadol, Nes Gadol, a modern great miracle. Feel free to always reach out to me for resources, books, articles, websites that I recommend to learn more about Israel, and continue, most importantly right now, to be safe. I hope to see all of you soon here in the synagogue when it is safe to return. And for that, I wish all of you a good day, and thanks for tuning in for a few minutes to learn a little bit more about why I love Israel. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.